Good morning, everyone, again. Here we are, back with English. I know your favorite subject. Well, if it's not yours, it's certainly mine. We're going to be taking a look at English 10B, Unit 6, Lesson 5, Writing an Analytical Essay. As I know, many of you have struggled with it. You've asked me about it. You don't know how to do it. And in fact, you mostly avoid it if you can. Or send it with an IDK, which always gets you a reset. Okay, so we're talking about writing an analytical essay, which is a little bit of work, but it's not as hard as it may seem. Okay, so what I wanted to do is start with, obviously you would have read a story. If you haven't read a story, that's going to be the first thing that you need to do, and they gave you a whole list in there. One of the stories was called The Monkey's Paw, and I decided to use that one because it's kind of a fun story and it's pretty enjoyable to read. And we also have it in our English 10 books, so it's easy access for you. So after you've read your story, the PLP provides you with this sheet full of questions, and they want you to answer these questions before you proceed. So this is what we're going to go through today, is how we answer these questions based on the monkey's paw. Okay, and I'm going to do it for you. It doesn't mean that you get to use this to do in yours, because this is sort of the kind of thing where I do it, you know, I let you try to do it, then I reevaluate what you do, then you get to do it again. Okay, so this is what we call a gradual release model, and so this is the step one of gradual release. The first thing in your analytical essay is going to be, the question was, what's the title of your story? Well, in our case, it's The Monkey's Paw, of course, right? The plot, that is the part that I often have talked to you about in English, of this curve, where we start out with our exposition, and then we get a little bit of information about the setting, the characters, you know, and the problem that's going to be presented that will give rise to the rising action and the climax. So we lay out a plot diagram once we've read our story, and we try and evaluate step by step how that plot unfolds. And that's what they're asking you for. They're asking you, what are some explanations or examples you could use? Well, I chose examples on my PowerPoint, and some of my examples were that Mr. and Mrs. White were expecting a guest. This is the beginning of it. The guest tells them about the monkey's paw three-wish story with a warning of what could happen. Number 3 is Mr. and Mrs. White make a wish for 200 pounds, which is, you know, money. And the next day their son dies and they're awarded 200 pounds, which at this point we're thinking to ourselves, maybe it wasn't such a good idea. Then Mrs. White makes a wish for him to come back against her husband's protest. Now, I don't know about you, but my experience with people who are deceased for longer than about 5 minutes is that they need to stay that way. And then, of course, after the wish, there's a knock on the door, and then the last but not least part is Mr. White makes an 11th hour wish, and of course his wish is that his son doesn't come back. Okay, so they ask you the question, what's the importance to the story? Well, the plot shows the conflict, the rising action, the climax, and the resolution, which is all about the action of the story. The whole plot is the action of the story. And that helps us understand the theme or the message the story has to give to us. Okay, so we've worked on the plot part of this. Now let's move on to characterization. The same kind of questions are asked about each one of these items. You know, what are some explanations or examples that you can use? For characterization, geez, I got some kind of marble in my mouth this morning. We're going to talk about each of the characters and how they behave. Their behavior tells us a lot about them. For example, Mrs. White, she coughed gently, she knitted placidly, she said things soothingly. She had a wish for 4 pairs of hands. Okay, and so this helps us understand the kind of person Mrs. White is. For Mr. White, he bawled about something, he looked up sharply, he eyed something keenly, he eyed something dubiously, and he said that he had all he wanted when it came down to him having to make a wish for something he wanted. And this tells us a lot about him in the context of the story, okay? So we kind of get a sense of what Mr. and Mrs. White are like. We had one other more minor character at the very beginning of the story, which was Sergeant Major Morris. And his manner was so impressive to the Whites. His tones were grave, though, which tells us something about him. He threw the monkey's paw in the fireplace. It also tells us something about him in the context of the story. If you haven't read the story, you have no idea what I'm talking about. So the issue is we're looking at the character's behavior and what they say and what they do and what other characters say about them and say about what they do. And that helps us understand these characters better. He also said something doggedly, and he had a look of alarm when he grabbed Mr. Smith's arm. Okay, so again, all of this is out of context because we're not reading the story, but it's just sort of brief details about some of the characterization. So what is the importance to the story here of all of this? Well, the characterization and behaviors makes the characters very much like ordinary people, which makes the story more believable. It also connects we, the reader, to them, and makes the reader as curious as the husband and wife are about the monkey's paw, which is important because the monkey's paw, it's not actually a character in the story, but it's a very important element of the story when you're thinking about the message and the meaning behind it all. Okay, so we've talked about characterization, we've talked about plot. Let's move on to the setting. In the very beginning of most stories is where we get our setting. That's the exposition part of the story. And in our particular case here, the night was cold and wet. It was beastly and slushy and an out-of-the-way place. The pathways to their home was a bog and the roads were a torrent. It was raining, by the way. And there were only 2 houses that were let there, that were rented. So it's very isolated, you know, and that setting is going to play into part of the story. Why is it important? Well, the story takes place in a cold, wet, isolated area, which creates a sense of mystery and fear. This helps build tension, especially for the second wish, which is the climax of the story. Okay, and you would know that if you had read the story several times, which is what I've done, okay? Next, we're going to talk about our point of view. Again, same questions. What are some explanations or examples? We're going to use some explanations here. So in trying to understand the point of view, I often look at the types of pronouns that are used. Okay, are they talking about we, or are they talking about he and she? Okay, and in this particular case, they're saying he and she, and that indicates a third person is narrating the story. So that means they are outside the action of the story, and they're telling the story, all right? So we know that. Now, there's other aspects to points of view, whether it's omniscient or limited. I'll discuss that later. Okay, why is it important to the story to know the point of view? Well, first off, a first-person narrator is not a very reliable narrator. That's like me telling you a story, you get one side of it. Okay? But a third-person narrator is more credible and reliable, which helps make the story seem more realistic and also believable. All right? The theme of the story, that's where we're moving on now. This is still focused on the sheet here. It says what are explanations or examples. We're using some explanations. A couple different possible themes in this story. Be careful what you wish for. Some things are better left alone. Greed, curiosity. Those are all themes that are manifest in the story, and you could choose any one of those to write about. Why is the theme important to the story? Well, most everyone can relate to these particular themes in this story through personal experience, and therefore they help the reader better connect and understand the reasons for the message and the theme. It's sort of a universal experience for most people when they read a story. An author typically has something in mind that they're trying to get across as like a learning experience. And this is a good learning experience, you know, about certain things. Most stories have that part of it. Okay, so moving along to our next choice, which is not a next choice. Let's see what we have next. We would be moving on to the drafting process. In your PLP, the next step is to begin creating a thesis statement based on what you evaluated. And so when we talk about thesis statements, and you should know this from skills class, is a thesis statement is nothing more than the subject you're going to write about and your opinion about it. Okay? All thesis statements are unique to the writer because, you know, you have an opinion and not everybody has that same opinion as you. So one of the things you want to consider when you're thinking about your thesis statement is what is your opinion about the story you read? Is it believable? Why or why not? Was it entertaining? Why or why not? What did you like about it? Why did the author write it? What can you connect to it? Okay? Usually by the end of the story, you really get an essence of something in there that's, you know, trying to make itself clear to you, and you need to evaluate that a little bit longer to understand the theme. Okay? After careful thought about this, I decided my theme is the short story, The Monkey's Paw, is a tale about human greed. Okay, I decided not to use the other ones because I felt I had more evidence to support this than any of the others, although there is evidence for the others as well. So if you look at my PowerPoint, you see that I've identified the subject, which is the monkey's paw, and I've identified my opinion, which is that it is a tale about human greed. Okay? So once you've created your thesis, we need to make sure we can support the thesis. We can't write a story if we have no evidence to support what we've asserted about the story. So I went back in on my story and I found evidence that I felt supported my thesis. One, Mr. White doesn't want the sergeant to burn the monkey's foot, even though he had that caveat from him, or rather warning from him. The reason he wants this is because he thinks there may be something in it for him. Okay, and that's evidence of some kind of greed. You know, there's something bad that could happen with this monkey's paw, but I still want it. Okay, because maybe I can get something from it. Then Herbert, who I didn't mention earlier in the characters, it was their son. He, right off the bat, as soon as Mr. White acquires the paw, he wants him to wish for money. So, but Mr. White initially thinks that he has everything he wants. So we kind of have a little bit of a conflict there. But Herbert wants money right off the bat. He wants 200 pounds. Then, after they get their wish, and their son is dead, Mrs. White wants her dead son back, no matter what the condition is that he's in, or how it might affect her husband. So, for me, these are all elements of greed, you know, a form of greed towards wanting someone back so bad you don't care what the consequences are if you get them back. 2, wanting money no matter what the negative consequences are, even if you've been warned. And 3, that you want something that you've already been warned may create some misery in your life. All right? In our next lesson, we're going to continue with the drafting process. Think about it. What's the next step after this? I'll see you next time. Have a great weekend.